Can't believe I bought into this place's crap reform program story. I'm supposed to be the construction foreman. It's my job to make sure the Eleos Retreat gets built to whatever standard these folks want so they can run this reform program or whatever.
Somewhere in the architecture of the settled systems, there is an assumption so thoroughly embedded that almost no one thinks to examine it anymore. It moves through law and policy and casual conversation alike, never announced, always present. The quiet conviction that certain people have made themselves into a particular kind of problem, and that the role of civilization, once it recognizes the problem, is not to solve it, but to contain it, to build walls around it, to route it away from the places where ordinary life is happening. Punishment, in this view, is not really about the person being punished. It is about the community doing the punishing, what it needs to feel safe, what it needs to signal to others who might be watching, what it needs to believe about itself, and the lines it has drawn. This assumption has served the settled systems reasonably well by certain measures. The United Colonies built one of the most stable and durable human civilizations in history, and it did not do so by being lenient. The Freestar Collective carved viable communities out of hostile frontier conditions that required constant, clear-eyed responses to threats, including threats from within. The broader project of human expansion into space has produced systems of order, however imperfect, that allow hundreds of millions of people to live their lives without constant fear. These are not nothing. The machinery of consequence and containment has genuine achievements to its name. But there is something the assumption tends to obscure, a question that gets buried under the practical urgency of maintaining order and the emotional weight of what harm actually feels like to the people who experience it. The question is not whether punishment should exist. The question is whether the person being punished is the same person who comes out the other side of it, whether the self is fixed, whether what someone did at one point in their life constitutes a permanent truth about who they are, or whether transformation is genuinely possible, not in theory, not as a legal fiction, but as a real and achievable human process. On a moon called Ixyll II, in a facility called Eleos Retreat, someone decided to take that question seriously enough to build a life's work around it. And what makes Eleos genuinely strange, genuinely unsettling in the best sense, is not that it exists. Places that offer rehabilitation have existed in various forms throughout human history. What makes it strange is the position it occupies, not as a minor variation within the existing system of punishment, not as a slightly more humane version of incarceration, but as a quiet structural challenge to the assumptions the broader system rests on. Eleos does not merely ask whether criminals can be rehabilitated. It asks whether the systems built to manage them actually want them to be. That is a different question. That is, in fact, the question worth sitting with. To understand what Eleos is pushing against, you have to spend some time with the landscape of justice in the settled systems. Not the formal legal codes, which are long and detailed and much read by people whose job it is to navigate them, but the underlying logic, the emotional and philosophical foundation on which all of it rests. The United Colonies operates what is, by any measure, the most elaborate and extensive justice system in human space. UC law has developed over generations into something that is genuinely comprehensive, a set of rules, institutions, enforcement mechanisms, and adjudication processes that attempts to handle the full range of human transgression in a consistent and predictable way. The appeal of this system, and it is a genuine appeal, is that it is not arbitrary. The same crime produces the same consequence, in principle, regardless of who committed it and who was harmed. The law does not bend for the wealthy or for the well-connected, at least in theory. It is administered by professionals who are trained, examined, and held accountable to institutional standards. Whatever its failures, and it has failures, it is not simply the expression of whoever happens to hold power at a given moment. What this produces in practice is a system oriented almost entirely around deterrence and incapacitation. The UC's philosophical approach to criminality is, at its core, behavioral. The problem is a pattern of conduct that harms others and undermines collective welfare, and the solution is to interrupt that pattern through consequences severe enough to discourage it, combined with physical removal from the community when the pattern is judged too dangerous to manage otherwise. Indentured servitude, a practice that exists in various forms across UC-aligned space, is itself a manifestation of this logic. The person who cannot be trusted in normal civilian life can at least be made useful, their labor extracted in service of the debt they owe. It is, in its way, an efficient system. It does not waste its subjects entirely. It just does not think of them as subjects at all, in the philosophical sense. It thinks of them as problems with a productive application. What gets lost inside this framework is the interior life of the person caught within it. Whether they understand what they did, whether the experience of punishment produces any genuine reckoning, or simply teaches them to be more careful next time. Whether the years of indentured service or institutional confinement make them more capable of living inside ordinary human society, or simply more practiced at surviving conditions that bear no relation to it. These are not entirely absent concerns from UC legal philosophy. There are voices within the system. There have always been voices within the system arguing for greater attention to what punishment actually produces in the person being punished. But they are peripheral. The machinery is not built around them, and the machinery tends to produce what it is built to produce. The Freestar Collective arrives at somewhat different conclusions through somewhat different premises. The frontier philosophy that shapes Freestar political culture, its deep suspicion of centralized authority, its emphasis on individual liberty and self-determination, its historical memory of the struggles that forced independence from UC control, creates a different emotional relationship to the question of punishment. There is a current within Freestar thinking that is genuinely more sympathetic to personal accountability in its fullest sense. Not accountability as a euphemism for punishment, but accountability as the acknowledgement that you are a responsible agent who made a real choice, and that real choices have real weight. This can produce, in the right circumstances, something that looks more like actual reckoning than institutional processing. But the Freestar frontier is also unforgiving in ways that the UC's more managed environment is not. Communities on the margins of settled space do not have the resources to warehouse their problems indefinitely. The social and economic fabric of frontier life is thin enough that serious crime, violence, theft, betrayal of community trust represents an existential threat rather than an abstract harm. When the Freestar Collective punishes, it can do so with a directness and finality that UC courts, with their appeals processes and bureaucratic layers, rarely match. The freedom to live as you choose in the Freestar conception is not separable from the freedom to face fully what your choices have cost. Then there are the spaces where neither system operates cleanly, where the maps start to blur, and the formal architecture of law and enforcement gives way to something rawer and more contingent. These are the spaces where organizations like the Crimson Fleet have taken hold. The Fleet is not simply a collection of people who have decided to ignore the law. It is a society with its own internal logic, its own hierarchy of values, its own understanding of what loyalty and betrayal mean and what they cost. The Fleet punishes its own members for certain transgressions and rewards them for others. It maintains order through mechanisms that formal civilization would not recognize as just, but that its members would recognize as predictable, which is its own kind of functional justice. What is interesting about the Fleet from the perspective of thinking about Eleos and what it represents is what it reveals about the relationship between crime and belonging. Most of the people embedded in Fleet society did not arrive there as blank slates making purely rational calculations about the most profitable criminal enterprise available. They arrived through particular paths: poverty, desperation, the absence of viable, legitimate alternatives, the pull of community and belonging in contexts where other communities were not available. The Fleet offers something real: a place to belong, a set of relationships that hold, a role within a structure that gives life legible meaning. That it does this through violence and exploitation does not make those goods less real for the people who receive them. It just means they are purchased at a price that falls primarily on others. All of this is the water that Eleos swims in. All of this is what it is trying to offer an alternative to. Ixyll II is not a world that announces itself. The approach through the system does not prepare you for anything dramatic. No sweeping geological formations visible from orbit. No atmospheric phenomena that catch the eye. Nothing of the kind of visual rhetoric that certain planets deploy to communicate their own significance. It sits in the Ixyll system northeast of Alpha Centauri, quiet and unremarkable, a planet that makes no argument for its own importance. The terrain around the retreat has that same quality: spacious, unhurried, capable of holding a person without pressing on them. When you land at Eleos Retreat, what you find is still being built. The structures are incomplete, the construction not yet finished, the full vision of the place not yet realized in physical form. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it is not incidental to what Eleos represents. The retreat exists at the moment anyone first encounters it as an act of will rather than an established institution, a bet placed before the outcome is known, a commitment made before the infrastructure that would support it is in place. That commitment belongs to Sloan Temitope, who envisioned the retreat and is driving its construction alongside Chief Administrator Nevin Bone. The story of how someone arrives at the decision to build a rehabilitation facility in the settled systems, not as an arm of state policy, not as a corporate initiative, not as the fulfillment of a grant proposal, is itself instructive about what the place actually is. The commitment that animates Eleos does not feel like policy analysis or institutional planning. It feels personal, which is what makes certain things possible here that formal programs rarely achieve, and what makes other things more precarious than they would otherwise be. Personal commitment of this kind can produce an institution that is genuinely alive, that adapts, that responds, that maintains a relationship with the humans inside it, rather than processing them through a predetermined sequence. It can also produce an institution whose existence is more vulnerable than it would otherwise be, more dependent on the particular individual who gave it life, more susceptible to the complications of trying to sustain idealism against the steady pressure of practical reality. Eleos has both of these qualities simultaneously. The vitality and the fragility come from the same source. What the retreat is designed to be, once construction is complete, is a rehabilitation community for convicts, specifically for people who have been imprisoned because they could not pay off their own bounties. This detail matters. The bounty system in the settled systems creates a pipeline into incarceration that catches not only the most dangerous offenders, but anyone who has accumulated legal debt they cannot discharge. Sloan's vision, as she has described it, is to take these people in, to give them the education, the counseling, and the practical resources they need to become what the system could not make them, reformed citizens with stable employment and a viable place in the world. The spaces being built at Eleos are intended to communicate something different from the environments of detention and containment that most of the future residents will have passed through. The goal, based on what you can see of the construction and what the people working on it say about the intentions behind it, seems to be a place designed to be lived in rather than endured, where the basic conditions of human habitation are treated as the starting point, rather than a reward to be earned. Whether that distinction sounds minor depends entirely on what you have become accustomed to. One of the most quietly significant things about Eleos is already visible before the facility is even complete. The people building it include ex-convicts themselves. Sloan and Nevin have already brought in people with criminal records to help construct and operate what will eventually serve as their own kind of refuge. This could be read as pure pragmatism. Use the available labor, pay people in the currency of reduced bounties, get the facility built. But it seems worth considering that this arrangement might be doing something more intentional than that. The argument that productive labor is part of the rehabilitation process rather than a punishment for past conduct, that having the capacity to build something real is itself a form of becoming different, is one that Eleos appears to be testing before the formal program has even opened its doors. Whether this is a coherent philosophy or simply a fortunate coincidence of practicality and principle, you can judge for yourself. But the fact that the first people to experience Eleos are being given the chance to make it with their own hands is not nothing. The tensions this creates are also already visible. The construction crew, the hired workers responsible for the actual build, are not uniformly comfortable working alongside people with serious criminal records. The distrust is real and understandable, and it surfaces in the arguments and friction that anyone arriving at the site will encounter. Foreman Jonah Halftown's concerns about accountability when one of his workers goes missing go directly to the ex-convicts first. The assumption that the people with criminal histories are the most likely source of any problem is exactly the assumption that Eleos is trying to eventually dismantle. And yet the retreat cannot yet point to a track record that would challenge it. It is still building that track record one difficult day at a time. The people already at Eleos Retreat, when you arrive, carry histories that don't simplify into easy categories. And one of the most striking things about the community taking shape there is how thoroughly it resists the temptation to sort everyone into the comprehensible and the incomprehensible, the forgivable and the unforgivable. The specific pipeline that feeds into Eleos is worth understanding because it reveals something about the particular shape of injustice that the retreat is responding to. The bounty system in the settled systems is not designed with transformation in mind. It is designed with debt in mind. When someone commits a crime serious enough to generate a bounty, the legal system creates a financial obligation as much as a moral one. Paying off the bounty is one path to legal resolution. For people who can afford to pay it, the matter becomes relatively simple. For people who cannot, for the colonists and frontier workers and marginal figures who accumulate legal trouble without accumulating the credits to resolve it, the bounty system becomes a door that only goes one direction. You end up in prison not only because of what you did, but because of what you could not afford. Eleos is, among other things, an argument that this is not the only possible outcome. That work, counseling, education, and a genuine chance at stable employment ought to be available as an alternative path, even if that path requires building the facility that will offer it before the first resident formally enrolls. Take Monika Blum, who runs the trading post at the retreat. Monika is a reformed convict, someone who has already been through the settled system's justice processes and is now making something different on the other side of them. She is there early, not as a success story to be displayed, but as a person doing the work of building the community that others like her will eventually need. The former Freestar Ranger, Sam Coe, encountering her at the site, recognizes her from a prior arrest. What follows is not a dramatic confrontation, but something quieter. Mutual acknowledgement and a willingness to let who a person is now carry more weight than who they were then. Monika's response that she has come a long way and that the retreat is going to help others do the same is not a speech. It is an observation from someone who has reason to know what distance actually feels like. The people helping build Eleos are not a uniform group. What they share is the specific legal situation the retreat is designed for. Bounties they could not pay, time served or serving, and some willingness, however tentative, however complicated by whatever brought them here, to try a different path. Whether that willingness is genuine transformation, rational self-interest, responding to a better offer, or some mix of both that can't be cleanly separated, is precisely the question Eleos will spend years trying to answer. At the construction stage, the question is almost academic. The work in front of everyone is literal. Build the thing and trust that the building is itself a form of beginning. The more philosophically charged element is what Eleos intends to do for people once it opens its doors fully. Based on what Sloan has described, the vision is built around education, counseling, and stable employment, a trinity that addresses not just conduct, but the conditions that made certain conduct possible. This matters because you can help someone understand that what they did was wrong and help them develop different responses to the pressures they face, and then send them back into the exact same pressures with slightly better coping skills. Whether that produces genuine change or just a more skillful navigation of the same circumstances depends on whether the material conditions that shaped the original choices have shifted at all. Eleos, by including employment as one of its central aims, seems to understand this. The retreat is not trying to produce repentant people. It is trying to produce people who have somewhere to go. Consider the specific population that the bounty system tends to generate. Not every person with an outstanding bounty in the settled systems is a hardened criminal operating from calculation and self-interest. Many of them are people who made poor choices under pressure and then found that the legal system's response to those choices created its own cascading pressure, bounties accumulating interest, legal options narrowing, the space between getting right with the law and spending years in a detention facility shrinking until there was nowhere left to stand. Some of them end up in the Crimson Fleet not because piracy was a considered career choice, but because the fleet will take people the legitimate economy has written off, and the fleet's demands, however dangerous, feel more survivable than the alternative. When these people eventually encounter Eleos, through whatever path brings them to Ixyll II, the rehabilitation process has to address not just what they did, but the entire chain of circumstances that made the fleet feel like a reasonable destination. This matters because the fleet is not merely an employer. For people who arrive in it young, or in desperation, or without anywhere else, the structure around them tends to become a world in a way that makes walking away from it a kind of exile rather than just a career change. The loyalty structures inside criminal organizations are real. The bonds of belonging are real, and the sense of identity they provide is real. Asking someone to leave that behind is asking them to give up a social self that has been their primary anchor. The replacement that Eleos is proposing, stable employment, a community of people in similar circumstances, counseling that takes their history seriously, has to be able to carry some of the same weight, or the alternative it offers will not hold. The stronger claim implicit in Sloan's vision, and it is a claim being made simply by not drawing the line at low-severity offenses, is that the possibility of genuine change does not disappear past a certain threshold of harm. Whether rehabilitation is applied only to the sympathetically understandable or extended without precondition to anyone willing to engage with it tells you everything about what the program thinks transformation actually is. Eleos, from what it is being built to do, appears to be making the harder argument that the capacity for change is not something to be earned by having the right backstory. What daily life at the retreat looks like, even at this early stage, suggests that the work toward that goal is not dramatic. The most visible thing happening at Eleos on any given day is construction. But beneath that, in the ordinary contact between people who are there because their legal situations left them few other options and who are now spending their days in close proximity to each other, something is already being tested. The community forming around the building of this place is not cohesive or simple. Old suspicions surface. The construction crew's distrust of the ex-convicts flares into open conflict when anything goes wrong. The social dynamics of a site where different categories of people with different levels of institutional trust are forced to occupy the same space are not automatically healing. But the friction itself is data. It is the first real test of whether the conditions Sloan is trying to create can hold, and of whether the people investing in them will hold too. The sincerity problem is the one that the critics of Eleos return to most consistently, and it deserves serious attention rather than dismissal because it is genuinely difficult. The argument takes several forms, but has a common foundation. When someone undergoes a rehabilitative process under conditions where the quality of that process determines real consequences for their future, a reduced sentence, a bounty discharged, a legal finding that makes re-entry into civilian life possible, the conditions under which genuine transformation could be distinguished from strategic performance do not clearly exist. The incentive to engage thoroughly and convincingly with the rehabilitation process is not separable from the incentive to appear to do so. People are, in the relevant ways, smart. They can identify what is being looked for and provide it. They can produce the behaviors and statements and emotional presentations that the process rewards without those presentations reflecting anything real about their interior development. Under these conditions, how would anyone know, including the participants themselves, whether what is happening at Eleos is real? This is not a frivolous objection. The history of programs that have attempted to evaluate and certify rehabilitation is substantially a history of people learning to navigate those programs successfully without necessarily being changed by them. The parole board has been gamed. The mandatory program completion certificate has been gamed. The incentive structures that attach measurable outcomes to processes that are fundamentally interior tend to produce good performance on the measurable outcomes without reliable access to the interior processes those outcomes are supposed to represent. Sloan appears to understand this. The structure of what she is building seems designed, at multiple points, to resist purely strategic engagement. The emphasis on genuine community rather than supervised sessions, on daily contact rather than scheduled evaluations, on practical purpose rather than performed contrition, all of this suggests an awareness that the sincerity problem exists and a deliberate attempt to make it harder to exploit. Whether it is possible to design around it entirely is a different question. There is also the critique that arrives from the direction of victims, and it operates on entirely different premises. This critique is not primarily concerned with whether the rehabilitation at Eleos is genuine. It is concerned with whether the orientation of the entire project is correctly directed. Justice, in this view, is not fundamentally about the future arc of the offender. It is about what is owed to the people who were harmed. The suffering of victims, the material and psychological damage they carry forward from what was done to them. the ways in which their lives have been permanently altered by someone else's choice. These are the morally central facts of any crime, and a framework that makes the interior development of the person who caused that harm. The primary concern is, from this perspective, a profound misorientation. This is not a position to dismiss lightly. The pull of retributive intuition, the sense that serious harm deserves serious consequences independent of any forward-looking calculation about optimal outcomes, is not simply reactionary emotion. It is a deep and widely shared moral response to the experience of violation, and it carries genuine philosophical weight. The victim who has not been restored, who lives with the consequences of what was done to them, who may never achieve the kind of transformation and forward movement that Eleos is offering its residents. That person's position in the moral landscape of justice does not become less important because a rehabilitation program has identified a more hopeful story to tell about the person who hurt them. Sloan, based on what we see of her approach, her consistent preference for listening, for understanding, for nonviolent resolution, does not appear to pretend this tension is resolved. Eleos is a rehabilitation facility, not a restorative justice program, and those are meaningfully different things. Rehabilitation focuses on the transformation of the offender. Restorative justice focuses on the repair of relationships and communities, on what is owed to those who were harmed, and on processes that can meaningfully address that debt. Eleos is oriented toward the first of these without claiming to fully address the second. There is a gap there, and the gap is real, and it seems consistent with Sloan's character that she holds it as an honest tension rather than papering over it. Then there is the institutional opposition, which arrives at Eleos in a form that is neither abstract nor theoretical. The Trackers Alliance, the bounty hunter organization that operates across the settled systems, has a direct financial stake in the people that Eleos is trying to reclaim. People with outstanding bounties are, from the Trackers' perspective, unresolved business. A facility that proposes to discharge those bounties through rehabilitation rather than capture and processing is not simply philosophically inconvenient. It is economically inconvenient. The tension between Eleos and the Trackers Alliance is not a disagreement about criminal justice philosophy. It is a collision between two entirely different models of what to do with people who have stepped outside the law, one built around recovery, the other built around retrieval. When trackers arrive at the retreat, the people they are there to collect are the same people Sloan is trying to protect. The confrontation this creates is a version in miniature of the larger question the retreat embodies. Does the system want these people to change, or does it want to process them back through the machinery they came from? Sloan's response to these confrontations is, characteristically, to look for the nonviolent path first, to try to persuade rather than to escalate, to understand what the trackers are afraid of rather than simply resisting them. Whether this works, and how reliably, is another of those questions that Eleos is in the process of answering. What transformation costs the person going through it is something that rarely enters the public conversation about rehabilitation, and the omission matters. To change in the ways that Eleos is designed to ask its future residents to change, not cosmetically, not strategically, but in the genuine ways that alter how you relate to yourself and to others and to what you have done, would require a confrontation with the self that is not psychologically comfortable. The psychological structures that people build around their worst moments are not arbitrary. They are functional in the precise sense. They allow continued functioning. The capacity to hold difficult things at a distance, to contextualize in ways that reduce their weight, to maintain a self-image that remains basically intact despite the evidence. This is not a moral failure. It is a survival mechanism. Dismantling it, even in a supportive environment with structure and community around you, carries real costs. Those costs tend to show up in ways that outsiders to the process underestimate. The disorientation that comes from having the story you have told yourself about who you are and why you did what you did begin to fail. Not the performed anguish of someone going through the motions, but the actual experience of a self-account that no longer holds together the way it used to, is, within the logic of any serious rehabilitation process, a sign that something real is being reached. But it does not feel like progress from the inside. It can feel like dissolution. One of the challenges for any program like Eleos is building enough genuine community and support that people can be held through these periods rather than simply damaged by them. Whether the structure being built at Eleos is adequate to that task is one of the things that will only be known once the doors are open and the work has actually run long enough to observe. There is also the question of what transformation does to identity continuity, what it means for the sense of being a coherent self across time. The person who would arrive at Eleos is not a collection of harmful behaviors waiting to be corrected. They are a full human being with a history extending far beyond the crimes that brought them there, a childhood, formative relationships, accumulated experience, all of it threaded through whatever version of themselves committed the acts that define them in the eyes of the law. Rehabilitation does not ask people to delete that history, but it asks them to reorient their relationship to it in fundamental ways, to hold the worst of it without being entirely consumed by it, while also not fleeing from it into whatever available form of self-exoneration feels most habitable. The mourning that genuine transformation involves, and one can reasonably assume it involves something like mourning, is not for the crimes. It is for the continuity that is no longer possible in the same unbroken form. The self that organized itself around certain patterns and certain relationships and certain ways of being in the world was not only a criminal self, it was the whole person in whom that conduct was embedded, including whatever was genuine and worth preserving. The transformation that Eleos is aiming for does not promise to preserve that carefully. It asks people to become genuinely different, which means letting something go that was real. Whether this is experienced as liberation, as loss, or as something that refuses both categories may depend entirely on the person and on what they have been carrying. The settled systems, in the ways it thinks about rehabilitation when it thinks about it at all, is largely uninterested in these interior dimensions. What the system wants to know is behavioral. Does the person come out of the program and commit more crimes or not? This is a legitimate interest, and recidivism is a meaningful measure. But it is a very narrow lens through which to evaluate what Eleos is actually attempting, and it tends to flatten the genuine moral complexity of what transformation requires and what it costs and what it produces in the people who go through it. Sloan's vision is broader than that measure. Whether the broader vision can survive contact with a world that only asks the narrow question is, like everything else about Eleos, still being tested. Pull back far enough from Eleos Retreat, from Ixyll II, from Sloan Temitope's particular vision, from the individual people and their individual histories, and you can begin to see what the place actually reveals. Not about rehabilitation in the abstract, but about the systems that surround it and the assumptions those systems are built on. Every theory of punishment contains, embedded within it, a theory of what people are. The deterrence model assumes that people are fundamentally rational calculators who respond to incentive structures, that they commit crimes because they have concluded, however imperfectly, that the benefits outweigh the costs, and that raising the costs will change the calculation. This is not an absurd assumption. It has genuine explanatory power for certain categories of conduct. But as a complete account of why people do harmful things, it is strikingly impoverished. It explains nothing about the person who acts on impulse or who is embedded in social conditions that make the calculus invisible, or whose conduct expresses something deeper and more tangled than a costs and benefits assessment. The incapacitation model assumes that certain people are simply too dangerous to be trusted in proximity to others. That the personal transformation question is, while perhaps theoretically interesting, not actually the point. The point is that the community needs to be protected, and removal is the most reliable available mechanism. This assumption is also not entirely wrong. There are people whose patterns of conduct are sufficiently established and sufficiently harmful that the question of transformation, whatever its theoretical interest, has to yield to the practical priority of preventing further damage. But as a general approach to criminality, applied not just to the worst and most persistent offenders, but to the full range of people who end up in the justice system, it is both wasteful and philosophically impoverished. It treats transformation as impossible without arguing for that conclusion. It simply acts as though the question has been answered. The retributive model is, in some ways, the most philosophically interesting, because it is the most honest about what it is. It does not claim to be producing optimal outcomes. It claims to be giving people what they deserve, to be enforcing a kind of cosmic accounting in which the moral weight of harm done is matched by the suffering of the person who caused it. This intuition is powerful and widespread, and it captures something real about moral experience, the sense that serious harm creates an obligation, that there is something owed that must be paid before the account can be considered settled. Eleos challenges the retributive model not by arguing against this intuition, but by raising the uncomfortable question of who benefits from acting on it. The victim who has watched their assailant suffer, has that suffering actually repaired anything? Has the harm been undone? Has the relationship or the life or the sense of safety been restored? The retributive satisfaction, if it is felt at all, tends to be temporary, and the conditions that created the crime have not changed. What Eleos is proposing is not an alternative theory of punishment. It is operating on a different axis entirely. The question it is asking is not what punishment should do to the person being punished. It is what society should want for the people who have caused harm. Whether the goal is the continuation of their suffering or their genuine reintegration into the human community. Whether justice is understood as settling accounts or as repairing damaged relations. These are not the same thing, and which one you prioritize depends on much deeper assumptions about what civilization is for. The settled systems, in its current form, has not resolved this question. Different parts of it hold different implicit answers. The UC leans toward the first version. The frontier communities often hold both in uncomfortable tension. The spaces outside either system improvise something else entirely. Eleos sits within this landscape not as a solution, but as a persistent, embodied argument that the question is worth taking seriously. That the second version, transformation and repair rather than suffering and settlement, deserves real institutional investment rather than the marginal existence it currently manages. Whether the settled systems is capable of moving in that direction is not something Eleos can determine. What it can do is demonstrate, case by imperfect case, that transformation is a real phenomenon, that people do, sometimes, genuinely change, that the worst version of who someone was is not inevitably the final version, that the space between what someone did and what they might still become is real and can be worked in and occasionally produces something genuine. This is not a triumphant argument. The outcomes at Eleos, whatever they turn out to be, will be mixed in the way that outcomes from any program working with human complexity are mixed. The facility is still being built. The full program has not yet run. What can be said now is not that it works, but that the attempt is serious. That the people making it are not performing idealism for an audience, but doing the difficult daily work of building conditions that don't currently exist anywhere else in this part of the settled systems. The retreat continues anyway, because the question does not go away, just because the answers are imperfect, or, in this case, not yet available. Walk back out through whatever you arrived in and back into the wider settled systems, and the question has changed shape. You started with something like, can criminals be redeemed? Which is, if you look at it carefully, a question organized around the interests of the observer. Can we, the ones doing the judging, extend the category of redeemable to include the people who have transgressed? Can we decide that the debt has been paid? The word redeemed contains within it the whole structure of accounting that defines the retributive and deterrent models. Someone owes something. Something is paid. The ledger closes. What Eleos proposes is not redemption in that sense. It is not the clearing of a debt or the formal readmittance of the transgressor into moral standing. It is something quieter and more difficult, and in the end, more honest about what human transformation actually looks like. It is the possibility of continuation, of carrying what you have done without being annihilated by it, of building something real after the worst of yourself, of becoming the kind of person who is genuinely capable of inhabiting the world without taking from it in the ways you did before. Monika Blum running the trading post. Ex-convicts laying the foundations of the facility that will eventually house others like them. Sloan choosing persuasion when the trackers come looking for people she has promised a different path. These are not heroic gestures. They are small, specific, imperfect acts of insistence. Insistence that the answer to what people are worth does not have to be the one the system currently gives. This is not dramatic. It does not close the account. The harm that was done does not disappear because a person has genuinely changed. The people who were hurt remain hurt. The damage remains damage. Transformation does not undo the past. What it changes is the future, and whether the future extends the pattern of the past or gradually, painfully, imperfectly diverges from it. The question that Eleos actually raises, the one that stays with you, that follows you back through the star systems and into the comfortable certainties of ordinary life, is not about the people inside the retreat. It is about the civilization outside it. What kind of justice does the settled systems actually want? Not theoretically, not in the public statements of institutions that have an interest in presenting themselves as rational and humane, but in practice, in the choices that get made when resources are allocated and priorities are set, and the question of what to do with people who have caused serious harm has to be answered concretely. Does it want to be the kind of civilization that takes seriously the possibility that people can become different than they were? That invests in the conditions under which transformation is possible, even knowing that it is not guaranteed? That understands justice as something more than the settling of accounts? That is not a question Eleos can answer. It is a question the settled systems has to answer for itself, slowly and imperfectly, through the accumulation of choices that are smaller and less legible than any single program or facility. In the meantime, on Ixyll II, the work continues. The structures go up slowly. The community forms around the effort of building them. The people already there carry the weight of what brought them here alongside the possibility of what might come after. Something real is being attempted. Whether something real will be achieved, whether the doors will open, whether the program will run, whether the first wave of residents will find what Sloan believes is waiting for them, is still a question. What kind of civilization builds the conditions for that to happen more often? That question doesn't live on Ixyll II. It lives in every court and every prison and every policy room across settled space. It lives wherever someone is deciding right now what they think people are worth. And it will keep living there long after the construction at Eleos is finished, long after the first resident walks through a door that was built in part by someone in the same position they are in now. The experiment has not concluded. It has barely begun.